Hello, Mr. Green. I am very happy to have an interview with you, a dialogue about politics of today and tomorrow. And I would like to start with the question who you are. How would you describe yourself in this scenery? How did you come to this topic?
Yeah, interesting question. So I practice as an economist in Australia, but I've been concerned about democracy for a long time, and it's sort of important for me to say I've been concerned about democracy since before the internet started having such a big impact on it. And like some other economists, I suppose, people like John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, I've become very interested in politics as well, because the two things are part of each other. How do we determine what kind of economy we want? Well, we do it with politics. So I've been sort of up close and personal with the trials and dilemmas of politics my whole life. I've worked for two cabinet ministers in Australia, and I've become very kind of concerned about democracy, and also, and this is an important thing for me, as I've thought about it, I've come across some extremely simple ideas, and I think when you're facing a vexing and complex problem, if you can see some simple things, then that can help you. It can help you navigate a very complex field. And that's actually one of the things I would say is a great strength of economics. It's often its weakness that economists think they know more than they really do. But if you can proceed with due humility, economics is a very powerful discipline because it's a very simple discipline. It basically focuses on a single idea. That single idea is opportunity cost, that I could be spending my time doing this, I could be eating dinner, I could be playing with friends, I could be trying to make money. And each of those things have a cost and a benefit, and here I am talking to you. That's a very simple way to look at the world. It won't tell you, might not be the best way to work out who to marry. Maybe it is a good way to work out who to marry. But it's nice and simple, and it's a framework, it's a scaffolding on which we can build an appreciation the way we want to. And I think there are some similarly simple ideas that can be introduced into our reflection on what's going wrong with politics. And it's that means that I have this audacity to think that I have something useful to say on the subject.
Yes. And if we talk about democracy and politics, how do you see the actual situation? I mean, we live in a situation, at least here in Europe, people are rather, let's say, tired of democracy. It seems they are never happy with politics. They are not happy with the situation in their country. And it seems that more countries, also outside of Europe, in many, many countries, you have this situation. So what do you think about this situation?
So I think that democracy is in a pretty bad way. I think that it's pretty obvious that people have a very low level of trust and faith in their political institutions. But I think that they somewhat get the diagnosis wrong. So when people say politicians are only in it for themselves, I think that that's a kind of, they're taking a mental shortcut, because what they observe is that politicians are always trying to manipulate them. Politicians are trying to get their vote. And that's how we've set up the system. We've set up the system, it's very like a shop. We're the customers, and we look around come election time and we say, well, what have you got for me? And what have you got for me? And, well, you're not trying hard enough. I think I want something more from you. And as politicians and their advisors and the political system have optimized their operations, remember, they're just like McDonald's are trying to sell hamburgers. Politicians are trying to get our vote. And something very similar has happened. McDonald's finds that, McDonald's hamburger, there's the sort of makings of something fairly nutritious, and then it's optimized. It's optimized with too much salt. It's optimized with too much sugar. It's optimized with too much fat. Why? Because that's how to sell more hamburgers. Mm-hmm. And the language of politics is a bland language of manipulation. Everything is focus grouped. There are lists of phrases that are supposed to play well. So if I'm a politician, I'll say something like, we have to take back control, which doesn't really mean anything much. In a globalized world, I'll say something like, we're going to roll up our sleeves. And it turns out that we're quite susceptible to these kinds of communications. Now, take a world where 50, 60 years ago, politicians the way they communicated was quite like the way you would communicate in a shop or maybe on a stage at a local political meeting, and then stick a camera in front of them, and they'll maybe turn it on a bit more, they'll focus a bit more, and so on. And then run the clock back 50, 60 years and have a whole army of people looking at the footage and saying, no, you should look a bit more active in that footage, and we'd like to present you as a friendly, and so we'll have your wife and your kids around you. This gradually becomes an utterly kind of morally vacuous and empty thing. The style of argument is professionalized and optimized. The style of presentation is professionalized and optimized. And in the end, there's nothing in it. We're fed this diet, which is quite like McDonald's, which is that we respond well to it in the short term, and in the long term, it makes us sick. In the long term, we don't feel that that's really food. And so when people say politicians are just in it for themselves, I think what they're really saying is that they feel manipulated, that they don't feel as if they're being communicated with as fellow human beings. And here's the rub. They say they want to be communicated with in that way, but they don't vote for it. So we have just had an election in Australia on the weekend. And, one of the things that people will say to you is that I want politicians to be honest with me. I want them to tell it like it is, and then I can decide who I'll vote for. Well, I'll tell you now that if you say that you're going to deal with climate change, that you're going to have a balanced budget, and you're going to spend more money on dental care for older people and young people, and more money on schools and more money on hospitals, and therefore taxes will be slightly higher, they won't vote for you. So we're all part of this system. So one of the things that is most destructive, I think, to making much progress is that we're actually part of this system, so much so. But of course, what's that expression about people in a shop? The customer is always right. So we're not owning up to our own role in this toxic ecosystem, and so we can go on making them the problem, and they're only the way they are because it makes us vote for. Because if they are any different, they're likely to get fewer votes, not more votes.
Mm-hmm. 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 So how does, let's say, democracy look then optimally for you in the future? How can this dialogue you're talking about, how can it take place? So how can we reinvent a new democracy?
Yeah, well, we can reinvent a new democracy, and the joke is that if we reinvent a new democracy, we will have got back if we reinvent it the way I want to reinvent it, we will have got back to old democracy. So what happened where democracy was invented 2,500 years ago was that there were almost no elections. Now, you might think, am I talking about direct democracy? Because the Athenians had a kind of a direct democracy. And the fact is that we have the technology to have direct democracy. You could get home from work every day and you could open up your computer and you could vote on 100 resolutions which are the sort of things that a parliamentarian would vote on if the parliamentarian was in Parliament or Congress or the Reichstag or whatever you people call your legislatures. And I think if you start really trying to imagine that in its concrete form, you would start getting the idea that maybe this isn't such a good idea. Another thing that would happen is that as issues went on the ballot paper and people were voting on them, there would be all kinds of alarms and excursions run through social media and the media, and there would be endless campaigning. And campaigning is a way of keeping information away from people, because the only effective way of campaigning is to campaign in slogans and with emotions and not to carefully deliberate on anything. If you carefully deliberate on something, it bores people and they won't tune in. So that we've got electoral democracy and we've got direct democracy. There's one, and in countries with tens of millions of people or even just millions of people, direct democracy is there are lots of reasons why I think direct democracy might appeal to people, but is not a good idea. So we're looking for a way to scale smaller groups. So the thing about a parliament or a congress or a legislature is that that's, let's say, 100 people, 100 Austrians, 100 Germans, and they represent us, we vote for them, and they deliberate on what the law is, and if they can get a majority on the floor of the legislature, that becomes the law. So that's one way to scale democracy, and it's gone terribly toxic because the connection between the people and the representatives, well, that's done through words, and words are slippery things. So there's one other way. The Athenians, of course, couldn't run Athens as a direct democracy. The ecclesia, the main assembly, met only once a month. And so how are they going to collect the garbage and keep public buildings operating? They didn't have elections. They had groups of people who were chosen at random, which sounds like an absolutely crazy idea until I tell you that that's what we do in juries, in legal juries, in court cases. So this is the other way to represent the people. These people are not elected, but what we know is that they're just like us. And so one of the things we do in juries in a court case is we say, well, if a jury splits 6-6, we're not very interested in what they tell us. If they split 7-5, we're not very interested in what they tell us. 8-4, maybe a bit more interesting. 9-3, there are plenty of jurisdictions in the world which you can convict somebody on a 9-3 vote of a jury. So with those two ideas, that we want ordinary people, and then if we get a group of them and they get lots of time to discuss things and they get support, the same sort of support that our elected representatives get, they get a research service and a library and access to people, and they can hold hearings and they can do anything they like in that regard. If they have that meeting and they come to a view and there's a fairly strong majority of them, not 51% versus 49, but say 60-40 or something like that, then I want to give that view quite a bit of authority in a democracy. So my model of the way a democracy should work is I'll keep the representative system that we have, but I'll have this other way of representing the people. And as we get more, and wherever it comes up with a strong consensus, I want that consensus to impose. I want the representatives, for instance, to be answerable to that consensus, and we can talk a little bit more about what that might mean. Um, uh, and I want that to cohere through time. Now, as a matter of fact, in Europe, we now have 2 citizen chambers in Madrid and in a province of Belgium. So this isn't as amazingly futuristic as you might think. It's already happening, but that's the sort of thing that that's the way in which we can introduce a whole other way of doing politics into our political system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, in principle, as I understood now, there are something like 2 ways. It is, on the one hand, it's the direct democracy, which you could even, I have a very crazy idea now, which you could even put up if you don't have a direct democracy. So you could anyhow collect signatures of others for something. And if you have enough, say if you have 500,000 or 1 million signatures, it means something in a country where you can't pass by without doing anything. And you don't even need to meet then. But in times like this, it is even not so difficult to meet, like in a webinar or on a platform, and discuss things and have this like civic parliament, like people coming together, sharing their views and coming out with. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you do that, firstly, you can't have a conversation between 500,000 people.
Yeah.
And secondly, the people who are selected by the process are the activists. So I'm not very attracted to that. I think we've seen what happens. We've seen what happens in our electoral system when we base political decision making around, if you like, activism. So now, by activism there, I mean the activism of big money and big power, which is to sink some money, put some ads on the TV, hire a lot of PR flacks, do the sort of thing that the Koch brothers do in the United States, where you make a donation to set up what's called astroturfed organizations, which organizations pretend to be grassroots organizations, which are not. So these are all methods of activism, and I think they largely scramble our democracy. And they have people think of activism in a rather romantic way, because activism was sort of invented in many ways by the left, and we associate activism with left-wing activity. But the Koch brothers are activists too. And that's what we're finding out. That's what we're seeing, that in a world of activism, everything is so emotive, everything is so presented for your instant comprehension that it actually destroys our ability to actually deliberate on the issues. So, yeah, I'm not. You count me as a skeptic of direct democracy. Although, you know, I obviously don't object to the idea that if you can get so many signatures that you put a petition into the parliamentary system, and there has to be some response. But if you look at what's happened with citizens-initiated referendums, and there's plenty of those. I mean, I think they work quite well in Switzerland, but Switzerland's got a very well-developed ecosystem for processing these things. It's got a lot of civil society organisations. But if you go to Oregon, California, then these citizens-initiated referendum systems, this is just direct democracy, just like Brexit. Well, how's that going then? So these things are exploited, manipulated by powerful interests. And here we all are saying how great it is that the people have a say, but the people have a say in a highly emotional, largely magical thing. If you look at Brexit, and I mean, I happen to think Brexit is mad, but even if I thought it made some sense, it's quite clear that the Brexit vote, that the campaigning on the Brexit vote was such that people were encouraged to make their vote expressive rather than deliberative, and there were all kinds of ideas that they were going to get £350 million for the NHS, for the National Health Service, that Europe would quickly, that Europe needed Britain more than Britain needs Europe. I mean, God, talk about magical thinking.
Yes, yes. So
and when you get people to deliberate on Brexit, guess what happens? You get a swing away from Brexit of about 10%. It's all over because people, as they talk it over, not with a political representative who will hector them and manipulate them, but with other people, they come into their own because they get a bit of confidence and they go, oh, I see, you're saying that, but what about this? Oh, well. And then they, in a group of people like themselves, they start to be able to say, well, look, I think that person over there represents my views better than anyone else, and they think a bit differently to me, and that's influenced me, and so on. So on some of the questions that are most troubling us, the evidence suggests that we do much better with this kind of system. And the environment is an example of that. So I'll get these numbers are in broadly right. I might have them 1 or 2 percentage points out, but in Texas there was a citizen jury, a randomly selected group of about 50 people, and they were asked going into the citizens jury, how would you be prepared to pay a little bit more on your electricity bill to ensure that you used more renewable energy? And I think 54% of people going in said yes. And after 4 days of deliberation, that figure went to 81% or 83%. So when people are together, they kind of, like we all do, think of electoral politics as road rage, and then think of the politics inside a jury as what would happen inside, when you're physically present with someone and you realise that they've got a point of view and your focus is not 100% on fighting them and asserting your rights. It's on hopefully believing you have rights and hopefully asserting your interests and then listening to their interests and trying to come to an accommodation. And that spirit has more or less completely disappeared from our politics.
So it is all about this dialogue. It is all about bringing people together to share their ideas, to make maybe compromises for a better world.
Well, it is, but that's a platitudinous thing to say, if you'll pardon me saying so. The question is, how do we build an institution that does that? Now,
exactly. This would be my question. Yes.
Yeah. So if you set up an institution and say, we're going to give the most power to the person who gets the most votes, then what you've done is you have based political decision-making absolutely at the foundation on competition, on self-assertion and competition. Nobody can become a politician without beating another politician. They can't even get into the parliament without beating other people. And once they get into that parliament, they form part of a fighting force and they try to beat all the other people. So the logic of electoral democracy is to take something about which we ultimately have to cooperate as a community and then say, we'll work out how we're going to cooperate by having a big fat competition. Now, that isn't as crazy as it sounds. If everybody's responsible, it can be a way of teasing out arguments one way or another and sharpening differences and allowing people to make clear distinctions. So there's something good about it. But it has at its heart the idea of competition, and then you throw in my analogy with McDonald's, all of the all of the staff advisors, all of the PR flacks, all of the money, all of the manipulation, and you've got a very meaningless, sort of very little meaning, plenty of aggro, it becomes a kind of war of each politician against the other to misrepresent their policies and their motives. Now, what happens in a jury? Well, you can certainly disagree with someone in a jury. It would be, you would hope that people will disagree with in a jury, because otherwise it's just a kind of bland exercise in groupthink. But there's no reward for disagreeing in a jury, and the fact that we've all got to try and come to a consensus that we can all live with lives with the process every minute of the day. So the psychological logic, the mathematical logic of this is completely different. And so it detoxifies a great deal of the toxicity of our system. And people, when they go through this process, they're basically elated, because, as Aristotle said, we are a political animal. By that he meant we're a social animal and we make decisions in the polis, in the city. But we're actually made for this. We were actually made to talk to each other and to come to collective decisions. This is completely consistent with our history and our biology. And elections are somewhat artificial. Now, we get by with artificial things all the time, but there's something more basic. And that's the thing that I think is so terribly missing, a sort of empty, hollowed out centre of our political life. And there are many things we need to try and do, but this is a very simple, rule-based way in which we can grow our own political culture inside groups of people, which is the only place where you can grow a political culture.
So the question is, what do people do when this very powerful instrument is not offered by the state, let's say by the political parties?
They do what an activist does. They go and do it for themselves. So it's very straightforward. If we could get some clarity around this idea, we can go and talk to some rich people like Bill Gates and ask them to toss us a few $1 million to get the ball rolling. We can crowdfund. We can bully our elected representatives, who, after all, are after our vote. We can bully our elected representatives with this institution, which we can build outside of politics, and it will have, if it's done right, it'll have a big impact. So if there's a big question, let's say you've got the question of Brexit in the UK, and there are 100 British people who meet in a people's assembly, and they're paid to do this, and they meet, say, two weekend days a month, maybe 4, and they are, and of course, if this was institutionalized properly, they would be paid. They'd give up their jobs for a period of time, and it's easy. And then let's say that Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn are playing their games in the House of Commons, and the whole thing is turning into just going down the toilet, basically. And, well, firstly, this citizens' chamber would start to be a powerful voice of people's anger. It would be like opinion polls tell us the opinion of the people. This would be a week-to-week beacon of the considered opinion of the people. It would measure changes of view as information came in.
Yes.
And I'm very confident that about 60% of those people would be saying that maybe Brexit, certainly in the form that it's been served up, is not to their taste. I think that would be extremely influential in the current situation. Ultimately, one of the things I would like to give a body like that is a single, very sneaky power. And it is to say this: if there's a supermajority of the chamber, which we then say represents the considered opinion of everyday people, then it should be able to impose a secret ballot on the other chambers of the parliament, because most of the worst decisions that have been made in my country, in Australia in 2013, we had a carbon pricing regime which was the product of over 10 years of political struggle, and it was abolished. And there had been and it wasn't that easy to get it through, but they got it through the parliament, and the party that won government had campaigned on this. But here's the thing: a very healthy majority of the parliament knew that it was a stupid thing to do. It's costing our budget about $11 billion a year, which is, yes, about 0.5% of our whole economy is money lost in removing this policy. So had a citizens' chamber voted with a supermajority, I think would have voted with a very strong majority once we had the scheme, not to abolish it, it would have been in a position to impose a secret ballot on the two chambers that had voted for it. And I think in that situation, the parliamentarians there would have been enough parliamentarians to say, I'm not voting I voted in public against the interest of my country, but now nobody knows who's done this. I'm not going to sell the interests of my country down the river any further. So I think it could make a big difference there. It could make a big difference on Brexit. It could make it. There are many questions that it could help us address, and then there are a whole range of other policies which are stuck because they're so easy to misrepresent. So a good example of this is the criminalisation of drugs rather than a harm minimisation approach, as is taken in, for instance, Portugal. Now, anyone who knows much about the subject knows that going in the direction of the Portugal model just makes more sense. You don't have endless people put into jail. You don't end up with more drug addicts. Yes. Now, of course, you can do these things badly and you can do them well, but this is the way. And there are things like having safe injecting rooms and all kinds of things. The only reason why our current democracy doesn't embrace these things more is because they are so easy to misrepresent. So that in the United Kingdom, things like trying to give prisoners some reason to rehabilitate and release them on all kinds of supervision. In Australia, we have a drug court, which instead of just punishing people and then releasing them, has a quite elaborate process of releasing them early, and they have to report back to the magistrate every week, and they can go back inside, and it actually helps train them to go straight. And it's clear that it doesn't work brilliantly, it just works better than the alternative. And that's hard to get through a normal parliament because your opponents will misrepresent you. Whereas if you bring it to a jury, the jury will hear from people, they'll hear from the prisoners, they'll hear from the people involved in the policy, they'll hear from experts who know something about it, and they will be able to come to a considered view, and it will be a more humane and thoughtful view than we can manage to have embodied in our current electoral democracy.
So, in principle, if I'm in whatever state, if I'm interested in co-creating, if I'm interested in getting a voice, I can start to make tables to talk about, and what are the small rules which should be obeyed, which should be put there. What is necessary?
Well, see, now we're stepping outside of an activist framework. So an activist framework would be to get together with people who think like you or
Yes.
pretty you and do stuff essentially to manipulate other people. So one of the difficulties of doing what I'm trying to do is that it involves anyone who's an activist to give away some power. In other words, they have to say, I want the people to have a say, but I'm not going to control what it is that they say.
Mm-hmm.
And I would argue that people who think of themselves as part of human liberation, if you like, that this is their friend. I would, and I'd give you the example of in the 17th century, there were two revolutions in Britain. The first was in the 1640s, in which they killed the king, and there was basically chaos. And they got another dictator to run the place. And after 20 years of chaos, they brought in the Restoration, Charles II, and it went back to monarchy. But fairly soon afterwards, in 1688, they had the Glorious Revolution. And the Glorious Revolution involved saying to the monarch, you're still the monarch, but you are monarch subject to law. Mm-hmm. So the monarch gave away a lot of power. And here's the thing. The monarch, this was the beginning of the rise of Britain as a global power, because the monarch, what happened when the monarch gave away some power and was subject to the law? The monarch could start borrowing money, because people could lend the monarch money and know that they could take the monarch to court to get the money back. Yeah. And so with absolute monarchs in Europe able to borrow at about 20% per annum, because anyone lending to them will want their money back very quickly, the British monarch could lend, and the Dutch monarch, which is where they imported this system from, could borrow at 3 or 4% or 5% or something. And they became, in the famous expression, a free nation deep in debt. So here they had enormous capacity to borrow. They were able to invest with that borrowing capacity and become hugely powerful by giving away their power. Now, what's the relevance of this here? If you are someone who thinks that human beings need to cooperate more, need to care for the planet more, then if you simply become an activist and go and promote climate justice and all that sort of stuff, good on you. I'm a fan of Greta and all of the things that we're doing. But that's still in the language, if you'll pardon me saying so, of manipulation. She's famous because we feel the authenticity of her message. It hurts us older people because what she's saying is right and is just. Mm-hmm. But what I think we need is something more than that, and we have to try and develop institutions in which that justice can be embraced by not just people who are already agreeing with her, which is roughly what's happening now. And so I think we can build these types of institutions. Now, so there are quite a lot of people running around promoting these mechanisms, and hence we have the one in Belgium and the one in Madrid that I spoke about earlier. And quite a lot of academics are talking about this, but this is very much supplicants to government. They go to governments and they say, here, we would like you to run a citizen jury. And what I'm trying to develop is an activism of citizen juries. So firstly, I've given you one vision of that, which is that we raise some money from philanthropists and from each other, and we crowdfund some money, and we can simply do these things. But and so anyway, I was quite close to getting £1 million from the Soros Foundation to do this with Brexit. I didn't get there. But the idea was to run a thing which I would call Brexit Deliberation Day, which is 10 citizen juries around Britain to deliberate on Brexit. So that anyway, coming out of that, in discussions with a bunch of other people, we sort of started thinking, well, how do we, in some ways, as you might expect for an Australian proposing this for Britain, that idea was a kind of a fly-in, fly-out idea. It was my idea, and I sort of said, let's grab lots of money and let's do it in Great Britain. And the people I was talking to said, well, the problem with that is you'll do all this and then it will disappear. So then we started thinking, well, how can we grow this organically from the institutions we already have? And I think that can be done, because I think, so the sort of idea we started toying with was the idea of, say, in a place like Manchester in Britain, the outer suburbs and the inner suburbs have very different views about Brexit. So what you could do is, you've got enough money with the Greater Manchester Council to fund a process whereby 50 people chosen at random from an outer suburb of Manchester meets and on an ongoing basis with 50 people from the inner suburbs of Manchester. Okay. And this becomes a regular thing, and maybe the subject changes. And what matters then is if you can get people in Manchester interested in how people's opinions changed. If they didn't change at all, I think it would be a great thing to do anyway, because human beings have far more to share with each other than they realise. Because it's so easy just not to talk to people who are not like us. So if it achieved nothing political, it would achieve a human and social thing. But I think it would achieve a lot politically, because I think people would, it would hugely undermine the way in which we different sides demonize each other. And as I put it before, it takes this out of the realm of democracy as road rage and turns it into democracy as a meeting of, if not friends, then people who we all know we have to live with. Democracy in the market or whatever. Democracy of face-to-face contact. So I think, and so I've actually kind of drafted up a sort of a manifesto for a global movement, if you like, called Reach Out, which would try to use these kinds of techniques to address things that hugely divide us politically. In America, you can think of gun control. In Australia, you can think of climate change. In Britain, in Europe, you can think of refugees. There are lots of these things. And one of the critical things is to introduce people who are privileged to people who are not privileged, and vice versa, and make it normal for all of these people to experience their political equality, their formal political equality. We all know they don't have substantive political equality, but we can start by enriching and deepening the formal political equality they have, which is that they're all human beings, they all have inherent dignity, and they can all have some influence on each other when they meet together face to face.
So this could be something like, let's say, a maximum mix of the population represented.
Yeah, well, it would be, the idea is to try to produce a representative group of everyday people.
Hmm.
But it doesn't have to be that. So what you might do is you might you might know that the group was, if you had 50 privileged people and 50 less privileged people, well, that's not representative because there are fewer privileged people than less privileged people. But at least that can help. And maybe you, for that reason, you want more of one type than another. But all I'm saying is you can vary this in different ways, so long as you know what you're doing and it's transparent to everyone. The critical thing, I think, is the contact, is the discussion, is looking for who is influenced by who and where conclusions came out and what people can live with and what they don't, what they really object to, and so on.
Okay. That sounds very interesting. And you say there is an example like this in Madrid. Is there something you can recommend to read further or to look further on some YouTube films?
I can send you links to a whole range of articles I've written. There's a Dutchman called David van Rijbroek who has written a book. I'll just get it out of my bookshelf, called Against Elections. I'm not against elections. I just want to supplement elections. But that's a very simple, compelling case against elections, and a case that could be replaced, that they could be replaced with the sort of mechanism I'm talking about. I don't want to replace them. I want to supplement them. The other thing that's good about that book is that it tells you about the history of democracy and how at the time of the French and American revolutions, the one thing that everyone agreed on was that we certainly didn't want a democracy. And that's one of the critical reasons why sortition or selection by lot, this approach that the Athenians have, which is to just get ordinary people, that's why they went with elections, because elections it was expected. Well, firstly, many of the elections there wasn't the full franchise, but even Americans figured they might end up at the full franchise at the time of the founding. The French similarly, but they felt, they felt strongly that whoever won an election was a kind of an aristocrat, and that turns out to be true. So the proportion of people in our legislatures, in our parliaments, with a university degree is well over 90% in most Western countries, and the proportion of the population with a university degree is under 50%. So there's a huge mismatch.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons why our parliaments, our legislatures are so unrepresentative. And of course, there are huge, there are two really big systematic ways in which our legislature is unrepresentative. One is they're much less representative of people without a lot of education than people with a lot of education. They're much less representative of people who are younger. So people under 40, not too many people in Parliament, people under 30, almost none. And they're human beings. That's what they are. And their interests are being sold down the creek, down the river. As people like Greta Thunberg show us, they're the people with the most skin in the game about the way in which we're destroying the planet.